If you had told me last week that I'd be working nights at an abandoned motel in the middle of the Arizona desert, I would have laughed. But life has a way of pushing you into strange corners, especially when you're broke and out of options. It all started with a job ad that didn't look like the others. Most were scams or dead ends, but this one was different. It just said, "Night guard needed Desert Star Motel, good pay, room provided, must follow all rules." No details, no requirements, just a phone number. I called because I was desperate. Rent was overdue, my fridge was empty, and my car was running on fumes. The man who answered sounded tired, like he'd just woken up from a bad dream. He asked if I could start right away. I said yes. He told me to arrive before sundown, then hung up. That was it. So, I packed a bag, filled my tank with the last of my cash, and drove toward the address he gave me. The sun was sinking low when I finally saw the old neon sign, Desert Star Motel. The letters flickered, buzzing in the dry evening air. The place looked like it hadn't seen a guest in years. Paint peeled from the walls, weeds grew through the cracked parking lot, and the only other car was a rusty pickup by the office. I parked, grabbed my bag, and walked up to the office door. The windows were dusty, and a faded "no vacancy" sign hung crooked in the window. I knocked, and after a moment the door creaked open. The man standing there looked like he belonged in an old Western movie. His hair was gray, his face lined and weathered by the sun. He wore a faded flannel shirt and jeans. His eyes were sharp and serious. "You Alex?" he asked. "Yeah, I'm here for the night guard job." He nodded and stepped aside so I could come in. The office smelled like old paper and stale coffee. There was a counter with a cracked bell, a couple of worn chairs, and a wall of keys behind him. On the desk sat a thick, battered notebook. He slid the notebook toward me. "This is the rule book. You read it, you follow it. No exceptions." I picked it up. The cover was soft from years of handling. "Is this a joke?" I asked, trying to lighten the mood. He didn't smile. "You'll see. Read it before your shift starts. Your room's number 7, down the hall. You start at midnight. I'll be gone by then." He handed me a key and turned to leave. I stopped him. "Wait. Why all the rules? What's so special about this place?" He looked at me for a long moment. "Just do what the book says. Don't try to be a hero. This place, it's different." He paused, then asked, "You got any family?" I shook my head. "No, not really." He nodded, almost like that was a good thing. "Good. Less to worry about." He left, and I was alone in the office. I set my bag down and opened the rule book. The first page was written in neat, careful handwriting. "Desert Star Motel Night Guard rules strictly enforced." I flipped through the pages. Some rules made sense. Lock all doors by midnight. Check the security cameras every hour. But others were strange. Never enter room 13 after 3 a.m. If you hear knocking from the pool area, do not investigate. If you see a guest in the lobby after 1 a.m., do not speak to them. I felt a chill run down my spine. Was this some kind of prank, or was the old man just crazy? I carried the rule book to my room. The hallway was dim, and the carpet was worn thin. Room 7 was small but clean, with a single bed, a desk, and a window that looked out at the empty pool. I sat on the bed and read the rules again, this time more slowly. Some had notes scribbled in the margins. Don't forget to check the back door. Always keep the lobby lights on until 2 a.m. Never ignore the pool. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling. Maybe it was just nerves. Maybe the old man was messing with me. At 11:45 p.m., I left my room and walked the halls, checking the doors and windows. Everything was locked. The only sound was the hum of the vending machine and the wind outside. Midnight came. My shift had started. I sat in the office with the rule book open, watching the security monitors. Nothing moved on the screens. The motel was silent, the desert outside even quieter. But as the hours passed, I started to notice things. The lights in the hallway flickered, even though I'd just checked them. The radio on the desk would pick up bursts of static, sometimes with voices hidden underneath. Once I thought I saw a shadow pass by the window, but when I looked, there was nothing there. At 2:30 a.m., I heard a soft, steady knocking coming from the pool area. I remembered the rule. If you hear knocking from the pool area, do not investigate. My heart pounded. I stared at the monitor, but the camera pointed at the pool showed only darkness and the rippling surface of the water. I gripped the rulebook and stayed where I was. The knocking stopped after a few minutes. The rest of the night was quiet. When the sun finally rose, I locked up the office and went back to my room. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I heard that knocking in my head. That was my first night at the Desert Star Motel. I told myself I'd get used to it, that the rules were just old superstitions. But deep down, I knew something was wrong with this place, and I had a feeling the worst was yet to come. I spent most of my first day at the Desert Star Motel in a fog of exhaustion and confusion. The events of the previous night, the shadows, the flickering lights, the knocking from the pool, kept replaying in my mind. Every time I tried to close my eyes and rest, something would jolt me awake, a creak in the hallway, a gust of wind against the window, the memory of that old man's warning. By noon, I gave up on sleep. Instead, I sat at the small desk in my room, the battered rulebook open in front of me. Sunlight streamed through the dusty window, painting stripes across the pages. I read each rule slowly, trying to make sense of them. Some rules were what you'd expect for a night guard. Lock all doors by midnight. Check the security cameras every hour. Don't let anyone check in after midnight. But then there were the others, the ones that made my skin crawl. Never enter room 13 after 3 a.m. If you hear your name whispered, do not respond. If you see your reflection moving differently in any mirror, leave the room immediately. If you see a guest in the lobby after 1 a.m., do not speak to them. Do not make eye contact. Pretend you don't see them. If you hear knocking from the pool area, do not investigate. Each strange rule had a note scribbled beside it in shaky handwriting. Some were warnings, others were little stories. Heard a voice last week. Didn't answer. Good thing. Saw a woman in the lobby at 1:30 a.m. Looked right through me. Don't engage. Room 13. Don't even think about it. I wondered who had written these notes. Was it the old man who hired me? Or someone before him? The writing changed in places, sometimes neat and careful, sometimes rushed and jagged, as if someone had been writing in a panic. I closed the book and stared at the wall. The motel was silent, too silent. Even during the day, it felt like the building was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I needed answers. I decided to explore. The hallways were long and dim, the carpet worn thin in places. I counted the rooms as I walked. 12 on each side, just like I remembered. But when I reached the end of the left hallway, I stopped. There was no room 13. The numbers went from 12 straight to 14. Where 13 should have been, there was just a blank patch of wall, the paint slightly newer than the rest. I pressed my hand against it. The wall felt cold, almost icy, even though the rest of the motel was warm. I pulled my hand back quickly and shivered. Back in my room, I poured myself a cup of stale coffee from the little machine on the desk and flipped through the rule book again. The more I read, the more I realized these rules weren't just for show. Someone had lived through things here, things they didn't want to talk about. I wondered about the old man. He hadn't come back since that first night. His truck was gone from the parking lot. I tried calling the number he'd given me, but it just rang and rang. No answer, no voicemail. It was like he'd vanished, leaving me alone with this strange building and its even stranger rules. As the sun started to set, I felt the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. I made a fresh pot of coffee, checked the security cameras, and walked the halls one more time. Everything looked normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. At 11:30 p.m., I sat in the office with the rulebook open in front of me. I read the rules out loud, hoping the sound of my own voice would make me feel less alone. Midnight came. My shift began. The first hour was quiet. I watched the monitors, checked the doors, and tried to ignore the way the shadows seemed to move just out of the corner of my eye. The motel was empty, but it didn't feel empty. At 1 a.m., I remembered the rule about the lobby. I focused on the lobby camera, watching for any sign of movement. For a while, nothing happened. Then, at exactly 1:17 a.m., I saw something on the screen. A man stood at the front desk. He wore a suit that looked too clean for a place like this. His hair was slicked back, and he stood perfectly still, facing away from the camera. He didn't move. He didn't speak. I froze. The rule echoed in my mind. If you see a guest in the lobby after 1 a.m., do not speak to them. Do not make eye contact. Pretend you don't see them. I watched the monitor, barely breathing. The man stood there for what felt like forever. Then, slowly, he turned and walked out of frame. I checked the other cameras, but he was gone. The lobby was empty again. My hands were shaking. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself it was just a trick of the light, or maybe a leftover recording. But deep down, I knew better. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Every sound made me jump. Every flicker on the monitor made my heart race. I kept the lights on, checked the doors, and clung to the rulebook like a lifeline. When the sun finally rose, I closed the book and locked up the office. I walked back to my room, my legs heavy with exhaustion. I lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling, the events of the night spinning through my mind. I realized something important. The rules weren't just suggestions. They were warnings. Someone, maybe the old owner, had seen things in this motel, things that didn't belong in the world I knew. And now I was seeing them too. Before I drifted off to sleep, I made myself a promise. I would follow every rule, no matter how strange. I would do whatever it took to survive my nights at the Desert Star Motel. But a small, terrified part of me wondered, how long could I really last? The next day, I tried to convince myself that everything I'd seen was just in my head. Maybe the stress was getting to me. Maybe the isolation was making me jumpy. But every time I looked at the rulebook, I felt a cold knot in my stomach. The rules were starting to feel less like guidelines and more like a warning from someone who had seen too much. I spent the afternoon pacing my small room, drinking bad motel coffee, and staring out the window at the empty pool. The sky was cloudless, the sun beating down on the cracked concrete. In the daylight, the Desert Star Motel almost looked normal, just another forgotten relic on the edge of the highway. But as the sun began to sink, the shadows stretched longer, and the air seemed to grow colder. That evening, I decided to be extra careful. I checked every door and window twice, making sure everything was locked up tight. I walked the halls, flashlight in hand, and made sure all the lights were working. The rulebook was always within arm's reach. I read through the rules again, whispering them under my breath like a prayer. As midnight approached, I settled into the office chair with a fresh cup of coffee and watched the security monitors. The motel was silent, except for the low hum of the vending machine and the occasional creak of the old building settling. I tried to keep my mind busy, jotting down notes in the logbook and making a list of things I needed to ask the owner if he ever showed up again. At 1 a.m., I remembered the rule about the lobby guest. I stared at the monitor, half expecting to see the man in the suit again, but the lobby was empty. I let out a shaky breath and tried to relax. Then, at 1:45 a.m., I noticed something odd. The hallway lights were still on. According to the rulebook, the hallway lights were supposed to be turned off by 2 a.m. I'd read that rule a dozen times. Always turn off the hallway lights by 2 a.m. I glanced at the clock. I still had 15 minutes. I told myself I'd get up and do it in a minute after I finished my coffee. But I got distracted, flipping through the rulebook again, reading the scribbled notes in the margins. I lost track of time. When I finally looked up, it was 2:07 a.m. My heart skipped a beat. I jumped out of the chair and hurried down the hallway, flipping off the lights as fast as I could. The bulbs buzzed and flickered before going dark. The hallway was plunged into shadow, and for a moment I stood there, listening to the silence. That's when I felt it. A sudden sharp drop in temperature. The air grew icy, my breath visible in the darkness. I shivered and hugged my arms to my chest. Then, the radio on the office desk crackled to life, spitting out bursts of static. I heard faint voices, too quiet to understand, whispering just below the surface. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was urgent, almost pleading. I hurried back to the office, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The monitors flickered, the images jumping and warping. On one screen, I saw a shadow dart past the vending machine. On another, the pool water rippled even though there was no wind. I tried to calm myself down. Maybe it was just a power surge. Maybe the motel's wiring was old and faulty. But deep down, I knew I'd broken a rule, and now something was happening. Suddenly, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Slow, heavy, deliberate. They didn't sound like normal footsteps. They were too loud, too steady, echoing through the building like someone dragging something heavy behind them. I checked the monitors, but the hallway was empty. The footsteps grew louder, closer. They stopped right outside the office door. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense. I wanted to call out, to ask who was there, but the rulebook's warnings echoed in my mind. Don't engage, don't investigate, just follow the rules. The doorknob rattled, turning slowly. The door creaked open a few inches, but no one stepped inside. I stared at the gap, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the door slammed shut. The footsteps retreated, fading into the distance. I sat there frozen, the rulebook clutched in my hands. My heart hammered in my chest. For the rest of the night, I didn't move from the chair. I kept the lights off, as the rule said, and watched the monitors. Shadows flickered at the edges of the screens. Sometimes I thought I saw faces peering in through the windows, eyes shining in the darkness. But whenever I looked directly, they vanished. At 4 a.m., the radio crackled again. This time I heard my own name whispered through the static. "Alex!" My blood ran cold. I remembered the rule. If you hear your name whispered, do not respond. I squeezed my eyes shut and covered my ears, refusing to listen. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, until it was almost a scream. Then, just as quickly, it stopped. When the first light of dawn crept through the windows, I felt like I'd survived a war. My hands shook as I wrote in the logbook. Broke the hallway light rule. Temperature dropped. Heard voices. Footsteps outside office. Door opened by itself. Heard my name on the radio. Did not respond. I closed the logbook and stared at the rulebook. I knew now that the rules weren't just suggestions. They were the only thing keeping me safe. I promised myself I'd never break another rule again. But as I lay in bed, trying to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Something had been awakened in the motel, and it was watching me now, waiting for me to slip up again. And deep down, I wondered, would I survive another night? The days and nights at the Desert Star Motel were starting to blur together. The strange rules, the eerie silence, the shadows that seemed to move just out of sight, it was all wearing me down. But nothing prepared me for what happened on my fourth night. I had been watching the security monitors for hours, eyes heavy but alert. The motel was quiet, except for the usual flickers and static on the cameras. I was about to pour myself another cup of bad coffee when I noticed movement on the lobby camera. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The lobby had been empty every night so far. But there he was, a man standing near the front desk. He was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, like something out of a black and white movie. A dark suit, a fedora pulled low over his eyes, and shiny shoes that clicked softly on the tiled floor. He didn't move much, just stood there, looking around like he was waiting for someone. I remembered the rule. If you see a guest in the lobby after 1 a.m., do not speak to them. Do not make eye contact. Pretend you don't see them. My heart pounded. I didn't know what to do. Should I call out? Should I try to find out who he was? But the rule was clear. I stayed silent and watched. Minutes passed. The man didn't speak or move toward the office. He just stood there waiting. Then something even stranger happened. Another figure appeared behind him, a woman this time. She wore a long dress, faded and torn, with her hair pulled back tight. She looked pale, almost ghostly. She didn't notice me watching her on the screen. The two of them stood side by side, motionless. I felt a chill run down my spine. I checked the other cameras. No one else was around. The parking lot was empty. The desert outside was still and silent. I kept watching. At one point, the man turned his head slightly, and I swear his eyes met the camera lens. For a moment, I felt like he was looking right at me. I blinked, and he was gone. I rubbed my eyes and checked the monitors again. The lobby was empty. I sat back, trying to calm my racing heart. What were those people? Were they real? Were they ghosts? I wanted to tell someone, but who? The old man was gone. No one answered my calls. I was alone. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I couldn't stop thinking about the guests. The next day, I tried to find out more about the motel's history. I searched online, but there was almost nothing. The Desert Star Motel had been closed for years, But there were rumors, stories about people disappearing, strange lights, and unexplained noises. One story caught my eye. It was about a couple who had stayed at the motel decades ago. They checked in late one night and were never seen again. Some said their spirits still haunted the place. I shivered and closed my laptop. That night, I was determined to follow the rules perfectly. No mistakes. At 11:50 p.m., I checked the lobby camera again. The man and woman were back. This time there were more of them, 5 or 6 figures, all dressed in old-fashioned clothes, standing silently in the lobby. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I watched as they slowly faded away, like mist disappearing in the morning sun. But then, I noticed something else. On the monitor showing the pool area, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the water. It was a child, maybe 6 or 7 years old, wearing a soaked white dress. The child's head was tilted, and she was staring into the water. I remembered the rule: never approach the pool after midnight. My heart hammered. I didn't move. The child didn't turn around. She just stood there, silent and still. After a few minutes, she vanished. I sat back, my hands trembling. The motel was full of guests who shouldn't be there. Ghosts, memories, or something worse. I wondered how long I could keep watching without losing my mind. That night, I wrote in my logbook, "Guests appear after midnight. They don't speak or move much. They vanish when watched closely. Pool is dangerous. Do not approach." I closed the book and stared out the window at the empty desert. The wind whispered through the cracked windows, carrying voices I couldn't understand. I felt trapped in a motel full of secrets and shadows. And I knew one thing for sure. I had to keep following the rules. Because if I didn't, I might become one of the guests who never left. After seeing the silent guests in the lobby and the child by the pool, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, pale, unmoving, watching me from the shadows. The motel was getting to me. I could feel it, like a cold hand pressing on my chest. But I kept going. I followed the rules. I checked the cameras every hour. I locked every door by midnight. I never spoke to the guests after 1 a.m., no matter how much I wanted to ask them who they were or what they wanted. I never went near the pool, even when I heard laughter or splashing in the darkness. Still, the feeling of being watched never went away. One afternoon, after another restless sleep, I sat at the desk in my room, staring at the rulebook. My eyes kept drifting to one rule in particular. Never enter room 13 after 3 a.m. I thought about the blank wall at the end of the hallway, where room 13 should have been. The numbers jumped from 12 to 14, but I knew there was something behind that wall. I could feel it, like a draft of cold air that didn't belong. I flipped through the rulebook, looking for more clues. In the margins next to the room 13 rule, someone had scribbled, "If you see yourself smile in the mirror, leave immediately." That made my skin crawl. What did it mean? Why would my reflection smile at me? I tried to put it out of my mind, but the curiosity gnawed at me. I needed answers. I needed to know what was really going on in this place. That night, as I made my rounds, I found myself drawn to the end of the left hallway. The blank wall was just as I remembered, smooth, freshly painted, colder than the rest of the motel. I pressed my hand against it, and for a moment, I thought I felt a faint vibration, like something was moving on the other side. I stepped back, heart pounding. I almost turned away, but then I noticed something strange. The outline of a door, faint but visible in the right light. Someone had tried to cover it up, but the shape was still there. I reached out, and without really thinking, knocked on the wall. The sound echoed down the hallway, louder than it should have been. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, I heard a click, a lock turning deep inside the wall. A narrow seam appeared, and the wall swung open, revealing a dark, narrow room. My breath caught in my throat. I knew I shouldn't go in. The rule was clear, but it was only 2:45 a.m. The rule said not to enter after 3 a.m. I still had time. I stepped inside. The room was small and cold, with peeling wallpaper and a single bed covered in dust. The air smelled stale, like old books and forgotten secrets. But what caught my attention was the mirror on the far wall. It was an old, ornate thing, with a cracked frame and a cloudy surface. I walked over and stared at my reflection. At first, everything seemed normal. I looked tired, pale, my eyes ringed with dark circles. I reached out and touched the glass. It was ice cold. Then something changed. My reflection blinked, but I didn't. I froze, heart pounding. My reflection's lips curled into a slow, unnatural smile. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the bed. The rulebook's warning screamed in my mind. If you see yourself smile in the mirror, leave immediately. I turned and bolted for the door, slamming it shut behind me. The seam in the wall vanished, leaving only smooth plaster. I stood in the hallway, gasping for breath. What had I just seen? Was it a trick of the light? Was I losing my mind? I hurried back to the office, locking the door behind me. My hands shook as I wrote in the logbook. Entered room 13 before 3 a.m. Saw my reflection smile on its own. Left immediately. Door vanished. The rest of the night was a blur. I kept checking the cameras, expecting to see my own face staring back at me from every screen. But the monitors showed only empty hallways and silent rooms. When the sun rose, I collapsed onto my bed, exhausted and terrified. I dreamed of mirrors, endless mirrors, all showing my face, all smiling that awful, twisted smile. When I woke up, I knew one thing for sure. There was something in room 13, something that could reach out through the mirror, something that wanted to take my place. For the rest of the day, I avoided the left hallway. I kept the rulebook close, reading the rules over and over, trying to burn them into my brain. That evening, as the sun set and the motel was swallowed by darkness, I made a promise to myself. No matter how curious I got, no matter what I saw or heard, I would never go near room 13 again. I would follow every rule, no matter how strange. Because now I knew the rules were the only thing keeping me safe from whatever haunted this motel. But as I sat in the office, watching the monitors and listening to the whispers in the static, I couldn't shake the feeling that the thing in the mirror was still watching me, waiting for me to slip up, waiting for another chance. And I wondered how many others had seen their own face smile back at them in that dusty old mirror. How many had never made it out? After my encounter with the mirror in room 13, I couldn't look at my own reflection without feeling uneasy. Every time I passed a window or caught a glimpse of myself in a shiny surface, I flinched, half expecting to see that twisted smile again. I started avoiding mirrors altogether, even in my own room. I'd brush my teeth with my eyes closed, shave by feel, and dress in the dark. Anything to avoid seeing that other version of me, the one that didn't belong. But the rules didn't care about my fear. The rules were there to protect me, and I clung to them like a lifeline. Every night before my shift started, I read through the rulebook, making sure I knew each line by heart. I couldn't afford another mistake. Still, the motel seemed to sense my fear. It pressed in on me, the walls creaking and the air growing colder as midnight approached. I felt watched, not just by the ghosts in the lobby or the thing in the mirror, but by something else, something lurking just out of sight. It was on my 6th night that I learned the true danger of the pool. The pool had always made me uneasy. Even during the day it looked wrong, empty, cracked, and filled with shadows. At night, the water seemed to move on its own, rippling under a wind that didn't exist. The rulebook was clear. Never approach the pool after midnight. I'd followed that rule without question. But that night, the motel had other plans. It started with a sound, a soft splash, like someone dipping their hand in the water. I was in the office watching the security monitors when I heard it. I glanced at the pool camera. At first, nothing seemed out of place. The water was still, reflecting the moonlight in broken patterns. Then, I saw movement. A shape, dark and blurry, floated just beneath the surface. It drifted from one end of the pool to the other, slow and lazy, like a shadow swimming in circles. I leaned closer to the screen, trying to make out what it was. That's when I heard laughter. It was faint at first, almost like a memory, children's laughter, echoing through the empty motel. It sent chills down my spine. I checked the clock, 12:17 a.m. I remembered the rule. My hands trembled as I turned the monitor off, trying to block out the sound. But the laughter grew louder, filling the office, bouncing off the walls. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The sound was inside my head, growing sharper, more desperate. Then, the knocking started. It was soft at first, coming from the direction of the pool. 3 slow, deliberate knocks, like someone tapping on glass. I stared at the office door, heart pounding. The rulebook's warning echoed in my mind. If you hear knocking from the pool area, do not investigate. I forced myself to stay seated. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. It sounded like someone, or something, was trying to get my attention. I squeezed my eyes shut and counted to 10. When I opened them, the sound was gone. I checked the monitor again. The pool was empty. I let out a shaky breath and tried to focus on my other duties. But the motel wasn't done with me yet. At 1:30 a.m., the temperature in the office dropped suddenly. My breath came out in white clouds, and frost formed on the inside of the window. The laughter returned, louder than before. This time it was joined by a woman's voice, singing a lullaby in a language I didn't understand. I looked at the pool camera again. A woman stood at the edge of the water. Her hair was long and dark, dripping wet. She wore a tattered white dress that clung to her body. Her face was turned away from the camera, but I could see her shoulders shaking as she sobbed. She reached out, her hand hovering over the water. I felt a strange pull, like something was calling me, begging me to come outside. I gripped the arms of my chair and forced myself to stay put. The woman slipped into the pool without a sound. The water swallowed her whole, leaving only ripples behind. I stared at the screen, waiting for her to resurface. She didn't. The laughter faded, replaced by silence. I sat there for what felt like hours, afraid to move, afraid to look away from the monitor. When the clock finally struck 3 a.m., I forced myself to check the rest of the motel. Every room was empty. Every hallway was still. But when I passed the window overlooking the pool, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Handprints, small, wet handprints, covered the glass, as if a dozen children had pressed their hands against it, begging to be let inside. I stumbled back, heart racing. I wrote everything down in the logbook. 12:17 a.m., heard laughter and splashing from the pool, saw a shadow in the water. 1:30 a.m., woman appeared at the pool, sang and cried, then vanished. Handprints on window, did not investigate, followed the rules. When the sun rose, I checked the pool again. The handprints were gone. The water was still and empty. But I knew what I'd seen. I knew what I'd heard. The entity in the pool wasn't just a ghost. It was something older, something hungry. It wanted me to break the rules, to come outside, to join it in the water. I promised myself I'd never go near the pool after midnight, no matter what I heard or saw, because now I understood. The rules weren't just to keep the motel safe. They were to keep me alive. And the thing in the pool was waiting for me to slip up. By the time my 7th night at the Desert Star Motel rolled around, I was running on pure exhaustion and fear. I was no longer just a night guard. I was a prisoner of the place, trapped by its rules and haunted by its secrets. Every shadow seemed alive. Every whisper felt like a warning. And every night, the motel tried harder to break me. I knew I needed answers. I needed to understand what I was dealing with before it was too late. The problem was, the old man who hired me was gone. His truck hadn't been in the parking lot for days, and my calls to his number went straight to voicemail. It was like he vanished into thin air. But on this night, just before midnight, I heard a car pull up outside. My heart leapt. Maybe it was him. Maybe I could finally get some answers. I grabbed the rule book and headed to the office door, listening for any sounds in the hallway. The door creaked open, and there he was, the old man. His face was pale, more tired than before, but his eyes still held that sharp, knowing look. "You're still here," he said, voice low and gravelly. "Yeah," I replied. "I need to know what's going on. What is this place? Why all the rules?" He sighed and motioned for me to sit. I did, clutching the rule book like a shield. "This motel," he began, "was built over something old, something dark. Long before the Desert Star opened, the land was home to a cult. They worshipped things that shouldn't be worshipped. They performed rituals here in secret." He paused, looking away. The motel was their last place. When the cult was destroyed, their spirits didn't leave. They stayed, trapped in this place. The rules, they're meant to keep those spirits contained. I swallowed hard. "What kind of spirits?" He looked me in the eye. "Not all of them are human anymore. Some are something else. They feed on fear, on broken souls. They want to escape." I shivered. "Is that why the guests show up? The ones I see on the cameras?" He nodded. "They're trapped souls, lost and confused. Some are dangerous. Others just want to be free." I thought about the man in the suit, the woman by the pool, the child in the white dress. What about room 13? The mirror? The old man's face darkened. Room 13 is the heart of it all. The mirror is a gateway. If you look too long, it can pull you in. That's why the rule says never enter after 3 a.m. The veil is thinnest then. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. "Why did you hire me? Why me?" He smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. "Because you have no ties, no family to worry about. You're easy to replace if things go wrong. I clenched my fists. Replace me? What does that mean? He stood up, his eyes hard. It means this place doesn't let go easily. If you break the rules, if you fail, you become part of the motel. Another ghost, another lost soul. I swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking in. But there's a way out, he said quietly. Survive until dawn. Follow every rule. And when you leave, don't look back. I nodded slowly, my mind racing. He handed me a small key. This opens the back door. Use it only if you need to escape. I took the key, feeling its cold weight in my hand. As he turned to leave, I called out, "Wait, what happens if I look back?" He stopped and looked over his shoulder. "You don't want to find out." The old man disappeared into the night, leaving me alone with the motel's secrets. I sat back down, heart pounding. For the first time, the rules made sense. They weren't just arbitrary instructions. They were survival guidelines. And I was running out of time. After the owner's chilling confession, I understood everything. The bizarre rules, the desperate warnings, the way he seemed to disappear and reappear. It all clicked into place. This wasn't just a job. It was a desperate gamble against ancient, malevolent forces. The Desert Star Motel wasn't just abandoned. It was a prison for the dead. And I was the reluctant warden. I spent the next few nights in a heightened state of alert, clinging to the rulebook as if it were a sacred text. Every sound, every flicker on the monitor, every whisper of wind outside sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I was following the rules perfectly, but I could feel the motel's impatience. It was testing me, pushing me, waiting for me to slip up. Then came the storm. It rolled in unexpectedly, a sudden, violent tempest that crashed down on the Arizona desert. The sky turned a bruised purple, and then black. Rain lashed against the motel walls, sounding like 1,000 tiny hands scratching at the windows. Thunder cracked directly overhead, shaking the very foundation of the old building. At 11:47 p.m., a massive bolt of lightning struck something nearby. The motel lights flickered wildly, then died. The emergency lights kicked on a moment later, bathing the hallways in an eerie, dim red glow. But the security monitors in the office remained dark. The electricity was out. My heart sank. This was bad, more than bad. This was a nightmare. Without the cameras, I was blind. Without power, many of the rules became impossible to follow. Check the security cameras every hour. Impossible. Always keep the lobby lights on until 2 a.m. Impossible. Only emergency lights were working. I tried to use my phone, but there was no signal. The storm had knocked out everything. I was truly alone, plunged into darkness with whatever lurked in the motel's shadowed halls. Suddenly, a cold wind swept through the office, though every window and door was shut tight. The emergency lights began to flicker, threatening to give out completely. I heard the sound of footsteps, not just one pair, but many, shuffling and dragging down the hallway. They weren't the distinct, heavy steps I'd heard before. These were softer, more numerous, like a crowd moving aimlessly. Then came the whispers. They slithered through the air, surrounding me. My name was among them, repeated over and over, sometimes softly, sometimes with a venomous hiss. "Alex, come play. Alex, we're waiting." I clutched the rulebook, remembering the warning. If you hear your name whispered, do not respond. I clamped my mouth shut, squeezing my eyes tightly for a moment. I forced myself to stay calm. What could I do? The rules were being broken by circumstances, not by me. I grabbed my flashlight and decided I had to make rounds. I couldn't see the cameras, but I could physically check the doors. It was the only way to feel even a semblance of control. Stepping out of the office, the darkness was oppressive. The emergency lights were barely cutting through the gloom. The air was thick with the scent of dust and something metallic, like old blood. As I walked down the main hallway, the whispers grew louder, swirling around me. I felt cold breaths on my neck, phantom touches on my arms. I swung my flashlight, and for a split second I saw them. Faint, translucent figures drifting through the walls, their faces pale and distorted. They were the guests, and they were everywhere. I moved faster, trying to focus on the task. I checked the lobby doors, locked. Good. I remembered the rule. Never enter room 13 after 3 a.m. It was only 1 a.m., but I knew I shouldn't even think about it. Still, as I passed the blank wall, I heard a faint scratching from behind it, like nails dragging on stone. I sped up, trying to block out the sound. As I approached the wing that held the pool, the sound of splashing reached me, louder and more playful than before. Childish laughter, chillingly clear, echoed from the darkness. If you hear knocking from the pool area, do not investigate. The rule. But it wasn't knocking this time. It was laughter and splashing. A small, pale hand slapped against the window overlooking the pool, leaving a momentary, shimmering imprint. Then another and another, until the glass was covered in ghostly handprints. The old woman's lullaby, the one I'd heard before, started up, soft and melancholic, drawing me closer. My mind screamed, "Stay away!" But my legs felt heavy, drawn by an invisible current. I forced myself to turn away, clamping my hands over my ears, trying to drown out the haunting melody. I had to get back to the office. It was the only place I felt even remotely safe. As I hurried back, the sound of glass shattering erupted from the far end of the hallway. I froze. What was that? Then the whispers became screams. Not human screams, but distorted, animalistic howls that ripped through the air. The emergency lights pulsed wildly, casting dancing shadows that looked like monstrous claws reaching for me. I sprinted back to the office, slamming the door shut and locking it. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely grasp the doorknob. I was trapped, blinded, surrounded. The storm raged outside, mirroring the chaos within the motel. I could hear things moving in the dark hallways, scraping, slithering, groaning. The motel's inhabitants were free, unbound by the rules that electricity and structure had imposed. I huddled in my chair, flashlight beams sweeping across the room. There was nothing I could do but wait. Wait for dawn. Wait for the power to come back on. Wait for whatever had been unleashed to calm down. But the screams continued, and I could hear, distinctly now, the sound of something large and heavy dragging itself toward the office door. Thump, drag, thump, drag. My breathing hitched. It was coming for me. I remembered the owner's words. If you fail, you become part of the motel. I gripped the rulebook tighter, my knuckles white. I wouldn't fail. I couldn't. I had to survive this night. But as the thump drag grew louder and the emergency lights flickered dangerously low, I truly wondered if I would see the sunrise. The storm raged on, pounding the Desert Star Motel with sheets of rain and thunder that shook the walls. I sat in the dark office, clutching the rulebook like a lifeline, watching the emergency lights flicker and fade. Every shadow seemed to move. Every gust of wind sounded like a scream. The motel was alive, restless, and angry. I glanced at the clock. It was 4:30 a.m., Only an hour and a half until sunrise. I told myself I just had to hold on, just a little longer. But the rules had been broken, and the motel was changing. The pounding outside the office door grew louder. Something was dragging itself down the hallway, slow and heavy. I could hear it breathing, a wet, ragged sound, like lungs full of water. I pressed my back against the door, heart pounding, and tried not to make a sound. Then, as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. Silence fell, thick and suffocating. I waited, barely daring to breathe. A faint voice whispered from the darkness, right beside my ear. "Alex, it's almost over." I jerked away, flashlight trembling in my hand. The beam caught nothing but dust and empty air. I tried to steady my breathing. That's when I noticed something strange. The rulebook, which I'd left open on the desk, now had a new page at the very back. The handwriting was different, shaky, desperate, as if someone had written it in a hurry. I picked it up and read, "If you survive until dawn, do not look back as you leave. No matter what you hear, no matter what you see. Walk away and never return." My stomach twisted. Was this the final rule? Had someone added it for me, or was it always there, waiting for the moment I needed it most? I thought about the old man's warning. If you look back, you don't want to find out what happens. The wind howled outside. The storm was starting to break, but the motel was still alive with shadows. I could hear the ghosts moving through the hallways, whispering, crying, calling my name. I knew what I had to do. When the sun rose, I would leave. I would follow the final rule no matter what. But the motel wasn't going to make it easy. The next hour crawled by. The emergency lights died completely, plunging the building into total darkness. I sat in the office, flashlight beam sweeping across the room, listening to the sounds of the dead. Sometimes I heard laughter, children playing in the halls. Sometimes I heard footsteps, slow and shuffling, like someone dragging themselves along the floor. Sometimes I heard my own voice calling out from somewhere deep in the motel. "Alex, help me." I bit my lip until I tasted blood. I wouldn't answer. I wouldn't move. Finally, at 6 a.m., the first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. The storm had passed. The world outside was quiet, washed clean by the rain. I stood up, legs shaking, and grabbed my bag. I took one last look at the office, the battered desk, the broken monitors, the rulebook lying open to the final page. I stepped into the hallway. The motel was silent. The air felt lighter, as if the building itself was holding its breath. I walked slowly, careful not to look into any mirrors or windows. I kept my eyes fixed on the exit sign at the end of the hallway. As I passed room 13, I heard a soft whisper from behind the wall. "Alex, don't leave me." I kept walking. In the lobby, the shadows seemed to gather, swirling around the empty front desk. I heard the voices of the guests, the man in the suit, the woman in the dress, the child by the pool, all calling out to me, begging me to stay. I kept walking. When I reached the front door, I remembered the final rule. Do not look back as you leave. I gripped the doorknob, heart pounding, and stepped outside. The morning sun was blinding. The desert air was cool and fresh, a sharp contrast to the stifling darkness inside. As I walked across the parking lot, I heard footsteps behind me. I heard laughter, crying, screams. I heard my own voice pleading for help. I didn't look back. I reached my car, hands shaking so badly I could barely fit the key into the ignition. As the engine sputtered to life, I stared straight ahead, refusing to glance in the rearview mirror. The voices grew louder, more desperate. "Alex, wait! Don't leave us, please!" I pressed my foot to the gas and drove away, never once looking back at the Desert Star Motel. As I sped down the empty highway, the sun rose higher, burning away the last traces of the storm. The motel disappeared in my rearview mirror, swallowed by the desert. I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town. I pulled into a gas station, hands still shaking, and sat in my car for a long time, trying to catch my breath. I was alive. I had survived. But I knew, deep down, that the motel wasn't done with me. I could still hear the whispers in the back of my mind, calling me back. And I knew that somewhere, in the endless desert, the Desert Star Motel was waiting for its next night guard. The sun was fully up now, burning bright over the endless Arizona desert as I sped down the highway, leaving the Desert Star Motel far behind. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white, my heart still pounding from the night's horrors. I didn't look back once, not even in the rearview mirror. But even as the motel disappeared from sight, I knew it wasn't really gone. It was still there, waiting for its next victim, waiting for its next night guard. I pulled into the first gas station I could find, my legs shaking so badly I nearly collapsed getting out of the car. The clerk looked at me like I was a ghost. Maybe I was. I sat on the cold concrete outside, trying to make sense of everything. The rules, the strange guests, the mirror in room 13, the entity in the pool, the old man's secret, the storm that almost killed me. It all felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. But it was real. I had survived the Desert Star Motel. Or maybe it had survived me. I called a friend from my phone, the first call I'd made in days. I told him I needed a place to stay, somewhere far away from the desert and its ghosts. He didn't ask questions. I packed a bag for my car and left the gas station, glancing once more at the horizon where the motel had been. A cold shiver ran down my spine. The days that followed were a blur. I couldn't sleep. Every shadow in my new apartment seemed to stretch and twist into something dark and hungry. Every mirror seemed to hold a secret smile. I tried to tell myself it was just trauma, that I was safe now. But the nightmares kept coming. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, heart racing, hearing whispers calling my name. Sometimes, I thought I saw figures standing just outside my window, watching. I started carrying the rule book with me, even though I knew it was just a worn-out book now. It was my only connection to the motel, and maybe my only protection. One night, as I sat alone in my apartment, the phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but something made me answer. A voice, low and gravelly, whispered, "You can't run, Alex. The Desert Star never forgets." I slammed the phone down, my hands shaking. I knew then that the motel's curse wasn't over. It never would be. I was marked, and somewhere, deep in the Desert Star Motel waited, waiting for its next night guard, waiting for its next victim, and maybe one day, it would come for me.